as time flies by, you'll open up your eyes wide. You feel it's gonna go your way. Hey, hey, it's a brand new day. Hey, 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 it's a brand new day.
You talked about setting up the different commissions in different countries, countries that are in such turmoil, Rwanda, places that have such conflict that the people are so vulnerable. What's it like when you arrive there, coming from Australia, from a very privileged country, to see people living there? Where do you begin?
You start, and I guess this is where it was helpful to be a diplomat for 20 years. You start by having to understand the political and social and economic and cultural situation that you're dealing with, because every country is different and the situation in every country is a product of the history. Now, for instance, to take one of the countries you mentioned, the Hutus and the Tutsis had lived quite peacefully in Rwanda for many years until their political leader decided to play the race card. What happened in the former Yugoslavia? Christians, Muslims, Croats, Serbs had lived together peacefully for generations until political leaders decided to play the race card. And what we've discovered, and one of the things that I work at, is once that genie of racial hatred or intolerance or discrimination on the basis of colour or race or religion, once that genie is out of the bottle, we're not very good at putting it back. What we have to do is create institutions that are designed, and specifically human rights commissions are, to educate our society that we need to be a culture of respect for individual difference, non-discrimination, equality, recognition of everybody for what they are. And so in so many countries, in Europe itself, I think Europeans got a big shock when the former Yugoslavia fell apart, and that was that terrible situation in Bosnia and the countries around there. They realised it could happen in Europe's backyard.
We thought it could never happen again after the Second World War, and it was just happening without us even... It was like, okay, just to interrupt, this is something that worries me, because the children are our future. And everything you're saying about teaching, do you think we can get to the children as efficiently as, for example, these San Andreas video games that have desensitized our children to a point that they can go around running people over in cars, slashing throats as a game? How do you think that we can compete with something that has become almost second nature to them, that they could be guiding drones and killing people for real and not even know it by being connected into central systems on a day like today? How do we sensitize these children again to realize that that isn't right when they play at it?
I think we do face a real challenge, and I think with all the wonders of modern technology and the internet and mobile phones and iPads and the rest of it, we have a challenge now that the culture of respect for other people basically starts at home. It starts with children. But if the children are spending more and more time playing games where they shoot other people or blow up buildings or whatever, we have to recognise that that is going to have some sort of mental impact on the children that are doing that. I couldn't believe it recently when I said my two young nephews, I said, what are you doing? They were sitting there with their two friends. All four of them were texting each other. They weren't actually talking to each other. I thought, there's something seriously wrong here. We may be in danger of losing the sort of empathy that goes with communications between ourselves as individuals. You don't get empathy, you don't understand sympathy or empathy from pushing buttons and shooting people and blowing up buildings.
It's a skin feeling that people aren't getting anymore.
You've got to have interpersonal connections and interpersonal reactions. And that's something that we pick up subconsciously from the time that we're children. Now, if our society is changing in that way, and it is, then I think we've got to adapt both at home and in the sort of educational programs that perhaps we have in our schools. And there's no doubt that that is having an impact. There's no doubt that some young people are desensitized to the point that you look at these horrific circumstances in the United States. I had to do a television interview in China last year, and China was saying all the things they've created, but you know, some of them, or a lot of them, want to be like America, is wealthy. And I said, well, look, in a country now where drug abuse and opioids have caused more deaths than car accidents. Maybe we've got a problem that the United States hasn't. Now, the United States has, in the last 12 months, begun to recognise that they have this huge problem with drug abuse of things that were supposed to be medical painkillers, but the situation's got out of control. They were overprescribed, and it's a problem in my country too. So we've got to look at what's happening in our society, we've got to do a reality check on what's happening, and we've got to be prepared to admit that we need to change our strategies for education or for getting through to our young people in a way that makes them really connect with us and with their society. Otherwise, they will be alienated and disenchanted with a society they feel doesn't value them.
Or victim and subject to that society without any recourse. This is what worries me, that by the time they perhaps realise that this isn't what they want for the future, because it's their future that we are now talking about, that it might be too late, that these big conglomerates that dictate that the children with learning problems take medication, even the FDA and the DEA published alerts and warnings because they themselves said that they couldn't compete with the finances of the laboratories, and appealing to parents to do their own research, investigation, and not just to jump on the bandwagon as we all tend to, it seems to be the trend.
Well, that's another challenge, I think. We live in a very, very rapidly changing world. When I was a kid, there were a few multinational corporations. By the time I was the Federal Human Rights Commissioner, we had 7,000 multinational corporations. By last year, we had over 80,000 multinational corporations, and they have over 770,000 subsidiaries around the world. Now, we now live in a world where a lot of big corporations are much more powerful than a lot of countries. To give you an example, 5 years ago, of the 100 biggest economic entities in the world, 49 were countries, 51 were corporations. By last year, of the 100 biggest economic entities in the world, 69 were corporations and only 31 were countries. Okay, so we've got
the uneven balancing of government, with these businesses being more rich and powerful than the government.
And that's where it becomes incumbent on us as individuals to take an intelligent interest in what's happening in our country. Because these corporations, in Australia where I come from, we have two of the three biggest mining companies in the world, BHP Billiton and Conzinc Rio Tinto. Now, as Chief of Staff to our former Trade Minister, I saw the power of those corporations. I'm not saying they're evil. What I am saying is that in many cases, while governments pretend they're running the country, if you look behind what is actually happening, the power of corporations which make big donations to elections is often a situation which produces corruption, not something that's completely unknown in Andalusia, I've noticed since I came here, but it's a huge problem
it's
in most of the countries I'm
unfortunately.
dealing with. It's worldwide. So what do we do in a world where big corporations, for instance now the ones, Apple and the others, who manufacture these toys and who basically are putting out there, in a society some would say it's becoming increasingly materialistic. I think we have to recognise that our society has become increasingly materialistic, and so that importance of us as adults conveying a sense of a value system, the worth of each individual. My father was a clergyman. He used to talk about the value of the human soul, but the worth of each individual, the dignity that everybody is entitled to, an equal opportunity that everybody's entitled to. Somehow we need to get that message through, and you're absolutely right. That message doesn't come from pushing Game Boy buttons or, you know, blowing up buildings down at the local game shop.
It's worrying, and I'm going to, when you were so close, you're in the government, as you say, you're right there. Did you have any power to do anything? Well, many comments about having Barack Obama, yay, great, but then it would seem that he couldn't do anything. Bill Clinton, and I'm going to tell you everything I know about the aliens, and I can't do anything. Can anyone do anything? You were right there. We can aspire together, but when you're there, can you make a difference?
I was very fortunate because, and this is also true in England and some countries, as the Chief of Staff to our former Prime Minister and our former Deputy Prime Minister, you're right next to them, and frankly you do have a lot of influence on what happens, but you're constantly dealing, and you're seeing all the time this interaction between the corporate world and the political world. You're seeing the fact that what goes to the top of the political agenda isn't the most vulnerable and disadvantaged people because they're not politically powerful. What goes to the top? They're
not even in the equation, from what you're just saying.
Very often they're not, and that was the problem with our Indigenous people in Australia. They weren't part of the equation. They were only 4% of the population. Technically they were there, yes, but they weren't ever going to change any government, and governments want to be elected and re-elected. one person can always make a difference. And I'll just give you one example. I'll never forget, in the 60s, I was arrested in my country for protesting against apartheid. Every time the Springboks came to Australia, we'd protest against apartheid. In about 30 years later, in 1994-95, I think it was, I had the privilege of sitting down in South Africa. At that stage, I was working as an Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and I'd helped set up their National Human Rights Commission. I had Thabo Mbeki on one side of me and F.W. de Klerk on the other. And if anybody had told me when I was being arrested for fighting the apartheid system or objecting to it, that I would be sitting down at a point where that country had got rid of this racist-based system, I wouldn't have believed them. And I use that example sometimes in saying to young people I'm teaching, you can always make a difference. You mightn't see the difference you're making, but if you care about other people, if you treat other people with dignity and respect, if you care for those less advantaged than yourselves, then that has a multiplier effect. And sooner or later, it may have a much bigger effect than you think is possible.
I have to say that everyone who listens to my radio show knows that Barry Manilow's One Voice is one of my favourites, because it starts with just one voice and you join the other ones together, and the power, that sound that we can make, the movement that can happen.
Yeah.
We're in a small community, 27 kilometres of coastline, but 147 nationalities. Before we finish, Brian and I, as I say, I hope this is the first of many. You've come to semi-retire in Marbella because you think it's an ideal place for you to pass on now the message that you see is the next step. Please, there's the camera, what's that message? What would you ask of us that are here watching you?
I think the message that I would convey, and very often I'm not in countries as fortunate as this, is that those of us who live in a society as fortunate as this one is, those of who are blessed with good health and have had the privilege of a good education, have a commensurate responsibility to give back. And I think one of the things I find inspiring about this part of the world is that there are so many community service organisations that are giving back. I mean, and you can do that here. My wife doesn't speak Spanish, but she works for what you call the Butterfly Foundation, the Mariposa thing, because you've got children who have this terrible problem where their skin doesn't heal properly.
Yes.
And there are so many organisations like that. And I had to talk to Rotary last week, and they're doing things about mental health, mental illness, some of these problems that we don't yet recognise, some of these problems where people, elderly people with dementia, sometimes with Alzheimer's, are suffering or are alone, sometimes living without their partner who's passed on. If we can go out to them, if we can demonstrate a spirit of generosity, and sometimes perhaps putting our own self second and giving up our time and our money, I think that's a wonderfully inspiring thing about this part of the world. And I think those of us who are fortunate enough to live here all of the time or part of the time can take that message to perhaps some of the poorer areas of this country and maybe some of the poorer countries of the world.
Perfect. Beautifully said. Brian, it's an absolute honour to meet you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nicole. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Wow. As I say, you just never know who you're going to be sitting next to in Marbella.
Hey, hey.
Free taxi 4 times a month and 25% discount on your car insurance if you're the Zero Hero. When you see this Zero Hero sticker, you will know that the establishment where you're seeing it is part of our Zero Hero incentive. The idea is to try and keep our 27 kilometres of coastline road as safe as possible. 147 nationalities, all driving every which way but loose, unfortunately, so we need to be extra careful. So businesses like the Urban Villa, the Kempinski Hotel, the whole of the Lineker Group, which is Tibu, Babylonia, Portside, also the Boardwalk, the Harbour, Beckett's, the Playwrights, La Red Chiringuito, have all got on board so far with this fabulous incentive. The idea is you come with your friends, 3 of you are drinking, 1 of you is going to be the person taking those people home safely. You don't pay for your soft drinks. Each establishment can make their own specific rules, but that is the gist of it. Go to our website, marbellanowtv.com, for full details.
Hey, hey.
Hear yay, read all about it. Tomorrow is Thursday, and that means you can pick up your free edition of the Euro Weekly newspaper. And if you do, why not check out my column, Marbella Moments. If you'd like to check out previous columns of the Euro Weekly, or any of our previous programs of Marbella Now TV or me, Marbella FM. More information on our United Nationalities of Marbella Summit and all the events and incentives that we're doing, please go to our website, marbellanowtv.com. We'll see you tomorrow. Take care of yourselves. Be nice to each other. Hasta mañana.
And it's time.